Everybody see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Jolly good. Well, lovely to be with you again. Thank you again to everyone who's contacted me. And it's very helpful actually to get some feedback, because I, particularly to know, what has resonated with people. And if there's questions which I can pick up in later lectures. So there's my website on the screen. And if you like to use the contact form on the website to get in touch, I'd love to hear from you. I was very struck by one of the people, one of the comments that I received during the week. One person said to me how she was struck by the number of different people in different ways who are discussing the same issues. And she found the whole thing very encouraging and thought we were living in quite exciting times. And it's very easy to focus on the negative and say it's all going down the pan. But in fact, here was a lovely encouragement to see the positive side of this. And I hope that in what I'm doing, I'm offering something which Christians can use to contribute to this debate. Well, just to recap very briefly on last week, overall, I'm taking the theme that we're living in a time of judgment, and that God is holding up a mirror in which we can see what's going on in the world. And my second overall point is the crisis we face, or the challenge, shall we say, is spiritual. It's not simply political or economic or medical, it's also a spiritual challenge. And so in that context, last week, we looked at what I call the imperative of justice. And we saw that justice is rooted in the law, which is shaped by the concept of shalom. What is important is that law is administered with the spirit. We need to pay much more attention to the intention of the law rather than simply to the letter. And we looked at that issue. We then also considered the importance of leadership in establishing justice. That leadership is something which is vital to the way in which the laws are administered, and indeed the whole of society is structured. I then talked a little bit about the economic culture in which we are situated, and I shared with you one of my beliefs that we've been converted to a sort of new religion, like an economic religion, in which we are shaped by our appetites rather than by our hopes. And I ended up by saying that we need actually to think quite seriously about where this economic spirituality, this new religion, is leading us. And we need to take seriously the idea that enough is enough. So today I talk about a related topic, the topic of freedom. And I do that through the image of the vine and the branches, another one of Jesus's sayings in the fourth gospel. And I look how freedom should be shaped and equality should be shaped in what I call a rootless world. And I do this against the background that during the pandemic, we have had to put up with, and are still putting up with, significant restrictions on our freedom in order to control the spread of infection. I think most people have accepted this very willingly. But the longer the restrictions last, the more we hear protests that our freedom is being unduly curtailed. And behind these protests are various assumptions about the nature of freedom. And so in this lecture, I look at how Christians understand freedom and the related issues of equality and community. And in order to do this, I'm going to reflect a little on my experience of a visit to Latvia and Estonia I think it was in 2005, something like that. The three Baltic countries, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, are were until relatively recently under the were part of the Soviet Union. The Baltic Way runs for 675 kilometers. That's about 420 miles, joining the three capitals of Vilnius, Riga, and Tallinn. And I think this morning we may have somebody from Vilnius joining us. And if you're there, Sarah, lovely to see you. On the 23rd of August, 1989, 2 million people joined hands along the whole length of the Baltic Way. They were marking the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which divided Europe into Soviet and Nazi spheres of influence. And this pact consigned the Baltic states to a future under Russian domination. And if you visit the Occupation Museum in Riga, you can see a facsimile of the map. And it's just extraordinary to see this red line drawn across it. Literally, at the stroke of a pen, the fate of certain peoples in Europe was decided. This great human chain, the longest ever, made real and visible the hope and demand for freedom. And right now we see on our television screens huge crowds in Hong Kong and Myanmar demanding the same freedom. And 10 years ago, we saw even larger crowds in Tahrir Square in Cairo demanding the resignation of President Mubarak. In Riga and Tallinn, the main square is called Freedom Square. Freedom is precious, basic to our humanity, and many people have felt diminished by the restrictions placed on our freedom during the pandemic. And as I mentioned, what the pandemic has also shown up is the different views about freedom that we have. On the one side are libertarians who want a world with minimal restraints or no restraints at all. And they were well represented among those who stormed the Capitol in Washington on January the 6th. And on the other side are those who accept that there must be reasonable restraints on our freedom in order to protect the common good. The Bible has its own distinctive view of freedom. Freedom in the Bible is first and foremost freedom from slavery. The cry of Moses, "Let my people go," has lost none of its urgency. The slave trade was abolished in 1807. More people are enslaved today than when it was at its height, both literally and in other forms like bonded labor, the trafficking and subjugation of women and children, and conscription into labor gangs. Jean-Jacques Rousseau famously observed, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." Rousseau had in mind not only the oppressive use of monarchical and aristocratic power, but also the threat to freedom from the rising commercial class, a threat that has come to pass in modern life through the way freedom is constrained by the economically powerful. Millions are ensnared by 0 hours contracts and other oppressive conditions of employment. Even more, many millions are ensnared by the unfair terms of trade imposed upon developing countries by the economically powerful. And much more subtly and insidiously, even more people are ensnared by the gathering of personal data by corporate giants like Facebook and Google. And I referred to this when I mentioned in the first lecture the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. There is also the threat to freedom that comes from the growth of authoritarian regimes, whether terrorist, populist, or dictatorial. When I was growing up, I remember the threat to liberty came from the left. The fear was of Reds under the beds. Today, the threat to liberty comes from the right. Whether political or economic, what these examples have in common with slavery is the denial of the full humanity or autonomy of the oppressed person or group. Freedom in the Bible is about restoring this fullness. And in line with this, at the beginning of his ministry, Jesus chose to read this oracle from Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me. He has sent me to announce good news to the poor, to proclaim release for prisoners, the recovery of sight for the blind, to let the broken victims go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. While freedom in the Bible begins with freedom from slavery, it is not confined to it and includes freedom from all forms of oppression. The oracle that Jesus read comes from the third part of the book of Isaiah, relating to the time when Israel had returned from captivity in Babylon. Political oppression, like those protesting along the Baltic Way, that sort of political oppression was over. And yet within the society, there were many who were unfree and who yearned for liberation among their own people. And the oracle that Jesus read contains 3 examples. There's the poor and the indebted, imprisoned by the misery of their condition. And the scholars tell us that when Isaiah spoke about release for prisoners, that's what he meant, those who are imprisoned by debt. Secondly, the blind, imprisoned by their inability to find their way. And we include the spiritually blind as well as the physically blind. And then thirdly, the broken victims, those imprisoned by oppression and bondage. In taking these words to inaugurate his ministry, Jesus identified himself with Isaiah's call for liberation. And we need to take this to heart in the new normal. So often we read this stuff in the Bible and its true meaning just escapes us. It was many years after I was ordained that the real significance of what Jesus chose to say as he began his ministry dawned on me. We've heard these stories so often that we fail to notice what they're really saying. The Bible is clear. True freedom is not simply a formal freedom, like freeing a slave legally, but a substantive freedom that requires concrete and generous measures that will return the slave to his or her full humanity. For example, the law of Moses limited slavery to 6 years, and when the slave was freed, the slave owner had to provide capital resources for a new start in life. And so it is Deuteronomy provides, do not let him go empty-handed. Give to him lavishly. I mean, that's the word, lavishly, from your flock, from your threshing floor and your winepress. Be generous to him, as the Lord your God has blessed you. This is a substantive freedom. Freedom in the Bible is a freedom that is rooted. It's rooted in truth, and it has a purposive character. The hope of the Israelites escaping from Egypt may have been simply for freedom from oppression. But in the eyes of God, it was also freedom for worship. God told Moses to go to Pharaoh and say, "These are the words of the Lord. Let my people go in order to worship me." In the Bible, freedom is never simply freedom from oppression. It always includes freedom for worship. That is, to contribute to shalom. Worship is more than saying our prayers. Worship encompasses the way we live the whole of our lives, in the marketplace as well as in the holy place. Freedom is given for contributing to shalom. And freedom is abused when we use it just to do our own thing, heedless of the common good. And this biblical understanding of freedom gives us an important criterion to judge the claims of freedom that we hear today. Freedom touches our lives as a river waters the earth. And it has a purpose, as I've just explained, beyond individual liberty. True freedom involves more than liberty to act in accord with our personal preferences, free from coercion, constraint, or other disabling factors. True freedom enables men and women both to act as they choose and to realize their own potential, setting them free for the life that God wills for all. This includes freedom from poverty, starvation, treatable disease, and oppression, as well as from force and coercion. In other words, freedom is about providing all that is required for human flourishing. It is the hope of this freedom rooted in truth that motivated those who linked arms along the Baltic Way, and which motivates all oppressed peoples today. Freedom is generally seen in terms of individual rights, like the right of free speech at the heart of the issue of regulating social media. It's hard to be against rights, and I'm certainly not. The focus on human rights in recent decades has brought huge benefits. And speaking for myself, I'm very alarmed at the professed aim of our government to resile from the European Convention on Human Rights. But rights have to find their place within the community. A claim of right acts rather like a trump at cards. When it is asserted, it is done so in order to win the argument, in the same way that a trump wins the hand. Rarely is it that simple. Rights are never absolute and are often in conflict. My right to enjoy my property is limited by your right to be free from nuisance. My right to free speech is limited by your right not to be defamed. But more important, from a spiritual perspective, making a claim of right puts the individual center stage and has encouraged a demanding, assertive, in-your-face culture that seeks to avoid blame and responsibility. The Bible takes a different approach. The Bible speaks of duties rather than rights. Thus, the Lord did not give the slave the right to freedom. Instead, the master was placed under a duty to free the slave. Similarly, the concept of shalom placed the community under a duty of care for its less advantaged and more vulnerable members. A purposive freedom that places the stress on duties rather than rights is a deep challenge to modern ideas. As Pope Francis has said, just because people are born in places with fewer resources or less development does not justify the fact that they are living with less dignity. Those more fortunate have a responsibility towards them, not simply of humanitarian relief, but for their general welfare and prosperity. And responsibility is another word for duty. God made us free in the way that He is free. Freedom is the gift that enables us to love, to delight in, and to care for one another and for all creation. And I think one of the things we need to do in the new normal is to find a new balance between rights and duties. I am the true vine. Dwell in me as I in you. You see on the screen a picture of one of our local vineyards here in Ditchling, Court Garden Vineyard, where for many years I've been picking grapes, and it is a great experience. Jesus reminds us that we cannot achieve freedom in our own strength. It is only to the extent that we are united with Him that freedom will be realized. He said, I am the vine, you are the branches. Anyone who dwells in me as I dwell in him bears much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. No branch can bear fruit by itself, but only if it remains united with the vine. No more can you bear fruit unless you remain united with me. To be free, and this is slightly paradoxical, to be free, we must be joined. We must be joined to the source of truth, like the branches are joined to the vine. Contrary to some modern ideas, freedom requires commitment. Freedom can only exist within a moral framework. To be free, Jesus says, you have to be grafted into what is real, rooted in the source of truth, like the branches of a vine. If freedom is not contained within a moral framework, if it is not rooted in truth, it degenerates into license and anarchy. Some years ago, I caught part of a radio broadcast in which the speaker said that the problem with our present age was not meaninglessness, but rootlessness. I have no idea who the speaker was. And in fact, I was listening as I was driving to an event, and I had to switch off before I found out. So I have no idea who it was who was speaking, but his words have remained with me. Meaning and strength and values come from our roots. As Jesus said, we shall achieve nothing if we are not rooted in him, nor shall we be truly free. Apart from him, as he said, we shall be like a withered branch that is gathered up, thrown on the fire and burnt. To be free, we must be rooted. The importance of roots cannot be overstressed. Roots anchor us. They give us our identity and our place in society and in history. Roots sustain us. Through them flows the source of life. Through our roots, we are fed and formed. Without roots, we cannot grow. Cut off from them, we wither and die. Roots keep us earthed. Roots keep us in touch with what is real. Roots are the source of truth. St. Benedict understood the spiritual importance of roots, and the first of the vows that he required his monks to make was a vow of stability, a promise of commitment to a community where, as we say, we put down our roots and let its life, its identity, and its values form the person that we shall become. Benedict contrasted the rooted monk with those whose way of life allowed them simply to please themselves and wander rootless from place to place. Those whom he called Sarabites and Gyrovags, which are wonderful words. Sarabites and Gyrovags are those who had the appearance of freedom, but not the substance of freedom. In the same way, the new normal needs to be rooted in something deeper than the shifting sands of consumer preferences. So we moved from Ditchling to France. If freedom is to reflect shalom, it needs to be rooted in equality and community. The French Revolution gave us the slogan, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. And while the revolution is not perhaps the best example of how to gain freedom, the revolutionaries were right in linking liberty with equality and fraternity. The pandemic has shown up the extent of inequality in our society, an inequality which feeds the widespread sense of alienation and apathy and of being trapped, what Rousseau described as our chains. Alienation is now much deeper than the alienation of workers from both the product of their labor and its value, described by Karl Marx. Today, the haves, as well as the have-nots, feel left out of account, that there is a basic unfairness and inequality at the heart of life. While the Bible does not have a doctrine of social equality in the modern sense of the term, slavery was accepted, for example, it does have a doctrine of solidarity that placed upon the rich a duty of economic generosity towards the poor, as we saw in the rules for the release of slaves. And this doctrine of solidarity underlies modern ideas of equality and community. Equality is like a bridge, bringing together those who would otherwise be divided. It allows movement and communication that are essential to freedom. Equality is basic to our health and well-being. Everyone benefits in a more equal society, rich and poor alike. This truth is clearly demonstrated in a book written by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, published in 2010, called The Spirit Level: Why Equality is Better for Everyone. The evidence they present shows convincingly that in the developed nations, inequality as measured by income is the one factor that underlies poor levels of health, trust, and education, and high levels of obesity, violence, crime, teenage births, and infant mortality. In the most unequal societies, and it is, I think, an indictment to discover that we are amongst them. The USA and the UK are two of the most unequal societies in the whole world. In unequal societies, the levels of health and social problems are highest. And in the more equal societies in the developed world, like Japan and Scandinavia, they are uniformly low. I was shocked to read in their book that in the USA, the richest country in the world, with the most sophisticated medical services, the rate of infant mortality is the highest in the developed world. Contrary to popular ideas, Wilkinson and Pickett show beyond doubt that greater equality does not just benefit the poor, but everyone. Everyone's freedom is diminished by inequality, rich and poor alike. If freedom includes not only freedom from force and coercion, but also freedom from poverty, starvation, treatable disease, and oppression, the very things that inequality increases, then in the new normal, we have to strive to create a more equal society. We move from a river in France to a river in Ethiopia. If what Wilkinson and Pickett say is true for the developed world, it is massively more so for the rest of the world, for whom inequality and exclusion is a direct effect of the global economic system. For most people in the world, like that little boy on the the left bank of the river, there is nothing liberating about modern economic liberalism. The belief that wealth would trickle down from the movers and the shakers to the moved and the shaken has proved completely false. Similarly, the claim that a rising tide lifts all boats. The economic tide doesn't work like the ocean. Economically, the bigger the boat, the higher it rises. Looking at the world from a European perspective, it is easy to miss the scale of the problem of inequality. The Spanish theologian, John Sobrino, described the reality. The world is not just a planet with typical European problems like secularization and agnosticism. It is a planet of poverty, where the main issue for human beings is to live and survive. The problem in the world is not, as they say in Europe or the United States, that there are pockets of poverty. In the world, there are pockets of abundance, and the rest is poverty. John Sobrino was speaking in 1968, more than 50 years ago. The situation is now far worse. And so we return to Tallinn. In June 1988, more than 100,000 people packed the Song Festival arena, the picture of which you have before you, for several successive nights, singing traditional Estonian songs. It was a powerful expression of identity and community, and marked a turning point in the struggle for freedom from the Soviet Union. One of the really positive things to come out of the pandemic is a renewed appreciation of the importance of community. But what do we mean by community? It's a word that's been largely emptied of meaning. Community is seen as a good thing, and so the term is widely used to give a spurious suggestion of unity to what are essentially disparate groups, like the international community, or even the local community. From a biblical perspective, community is more than creating a sense of togetherness in the neighborhood. It is much more to do with establishing a common purpose and identity, binding people together at a deeper level than the material and the protection of common interests. Among other things, the community holds the memories that give us our identity, as the Song Festival demonstrated. Community is about bonds that are not negotiated, not the result of a carefully worked out balance of interests. Community in this sense arises out of our common humanity and our common destiny. And just as slavery denies our humanity, so community restores it. In community, we are united with those we have been given, as in a family, not with those we have chosen. And this understanding of community is captured by the French term fraternité. It is about forming brotherly and sisterly bonds, recognizing that we are all in it together. When Jesus spoke of himself as the vine, he was using a communal image. The vine represented Israel, the society based on shalom that the law was intended to create. And when Paul spoke of what it meant to be in Christ, that is, united with the vine, he spoke of the way the three basic divisions of human society, race, status, and gender, were overcome. Baptized into union with him, you have all put on Christ like a garment. There is no such thing as Jew and Greek, that is race, slave and freeman, status, male and female, gender, for you are all one person in Christ Jesus. If freedom is to be freedom for, then it must be rooted in community. Community recognizes the importance of cooperation rather than competition, which in our economic culture has become the model for providing goods and services. I'm inclined to agree with Rowan Williams, who said, "A good deal of nonsense is talked about competition as the sole guarantor of excellence. Anyone who has been involved in intensive work, and the example he gives is of producing a play in a school, will know something of how excellence is guaranteed by the sense of mutual accountability, rather than any appeal to instincts of rivalry." And I think a lot of people working in the commercial world can apply those sentiments to themselves. Project development, for example, depends on a sense of mutual accountability. There are some areas where competition has no place. Competition in caring, for example, is part of the nonsense that Rowan Williams instances. And in those areas where competition is appropriate, in a world that is economically unified but not morally united, community requires us to see competition more in terms of striving together than striving against. This notion of striving together rather than striving against is underlined by the basic biblical social unit of the person in community. And I think that has much to offer today. Communal and individual interests are held in a creative balance, acknowledging both our interdependence and our individual worth, valuing individuality and guarding against individualism. Christopher Jameson put it this way: individualism is simply doing your own thing in your own way and blanking out other people. Individuality involves bringing your particular contribution to bear on the life of the community even if that is a difficult contribution for others to accept. In the biblical understanding, freedom can only be truly realized in a community. It is not something that we achieve one by one, individual by individual. Freedom is something that we achieve together, just like a community. As Julius Nyerere, the former president of Tanzania, said, "If the kingdom does not come for all, it does not come for any." God doesn't do special deals. The idea of the person in community struggles for recognition in a consumerist and individualistic culture marked by an insistent emphasis on individual rights. Asserting our rights is a way of keeping other people at bay, lessening the sense of community, whereas the biblical stress on duties promotes community. Freedom is not just about the way society is organized. And so I conclude with one or two comments about the inner spiritual journey that is necessary to freedom. Returning to those who joined hands along the Baltic Way, I wonder what kind of personal journey they were making. If we're not making a journey to freedom in our hearts, the just and caring society for which we hope will be stillborn. The French Revolution soon degenerated into a reign of terror. The revolutionaries might have won personal and political liberty. They might have had the right slogan, but their spirits were no more liberated than those of their former lords. And part of the human tragedy is how so often the demand for freedom results in another's bondage. Prevailing ideas become part of us and corrupt our spirit. In the West, as John Sobrino pointed out, we have all been affected by the prevailing economic spirituality. I've never forgotten my visit to Zimbabwe in 1991. Walking around a market where used cardboard boxes and goods that I thought of as junk were for sale. Even though my clergy stipend was modest by European standards, I had the uncomfortable feeling of being a rich man. Inequality imprisons the rich in their ideas, and not just the poor in their destitution. Personal liberation comes through an inner awakening, a new vision like Jesus offered to the rich young man. God offers us a mirror in which we can see how we have become acclimatized to injustice, so that while we might recognize it in the abstract, we no longer see it under our nose. This is movingly described by Sue Monk Kidd in her novel, The Invention of Wings. It's based on the life of Sarah Grimke, one of the pioneer campaigners against slavery in the United States in the mid-19th century. Sarah's inner awakening is described through an episode when her female slave Hetty takes a bath in Sarah's bedroom while she is away. When Sarah returns earlier than expected and discovers Hetty in her bath, her first reaction is anger that Hetty has assumed a forbidden privilege. But then, as Sarah really takes in the humanity and vulnerability of the young girl standing naked before her, a woman like herself, she sees what she had not seen before. I was very good at despising slavery in the abstract, in the removed and anonymous masses. But in the concrete, intimate flesh of the girl beside me, I'd lost the ability to be repulsed by it. I'd grown comfortable with the particulars of evil. There's a frightful muteness that dwells at the center of all unspeakable things, and I had found my way into it. It's the same with the way in which neoliberal economics has become the new religion. Most of us have grown comfortable with the particulars of the new economic dispensation. Perhaps we are aware that the heart and the soul have changed. But like Sarah, we feel this in the abstract, not personally. We have lost the ability to be repulsed by it, mute in the face of the new religion to which we have been converted. Lying behind Sarah's failure to let the truth really touch her was the personal and social cost that acknowledging it would entail. The truth that faces us, Jesus, is more often than not rejected or glossed over because it is politically or socially inconvenient or personally too demanding. If the new normal is to be shaped by the perspectives that I've looked at in these first 3 lectures, we shall need to make the same inner journey as Sarah Grimke. As Christians, we cannot settle for a morally neutral life, nor for a morally inadequate politics. It is in Christ alone that we shall find the truth that sets us free. And in the next 2 lectures, I look further at what the inner journey entails. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you for that sort of wide-ranging exploration of freedom in relation to economics and equality and fraternity, indeed. Are there any questions which people would like to bring to Peter at this point? So even if you haven't typed them in the chat function, do feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question directly. Okay, we've got a question here.
Seem to have silenced everyone.
Melvin asks in the chat function, J.S. Mills on liberty restrains the use of one person's freedom when it compromises another's exercise of freedom or his or her interests. This important qualification is usually overlooked, and so his essay has been used to justify the unrestrained laissez-faire of today in the UK and USA. Is his qualification enough, or does it ignore freedom for, in capital letters?
It's at this point that I wish I could remember what I'd read about from J.S. Mill. But I rather think, I'm not sure what his overall, maybe Duncan could say, well, maybe he won't want to.
Melvin,
but,
sorry.
Melvin, yes. What Mill's overall, sort of philosophical approach was. How did he conceive society? Was it just a group of people trying to do their own thing and keeping out of each other's way as much as possible? Or did it have some greater sense of pursuing the common good? Now, if it did, then obviously that's in line with the biblical idea that freedom is freedom for. The whole sort of Enlightenment movement was rather against this notions of social solidarity. And well, I'd have to come back. I'd have to sort of pick up my Mill primer just to sort of check on that. But I think that's what I'll just say for the time being.
Thank you. Melvin, whether you wanted to come back on that or someone more.
Yeah, well, to answer Peter's question, it's only been in very recent years that J.S. Mill has been revalued, and that to some extent he's now becoming to be regarded as a sort of very, very individual socialist. He wasn't a member of any socialist movement, but his theories, which have been, this is perhaps his best known work on liberty, but it was only a 73-page essay when I read it. And I think he did have a sense of overall community. It wasn't a sort of particularly Christian viewpoint, but he did see a larger society. He would have been horrified by Margaret Thatcher saying there's no such thing as society, for example. But he was very much an individual thinker rather than a member of a socialist movement. So I think, but I didn't read anything in anything he's written that talks about the concept of freedom for becoming fully human in the sense that you have in today's lecture.
Well, thank you very much, Melvin, for that. I mean, I think Jesus might have said, well, if he's not against us, he's with us.
Yeah.
Further questions? I mean, I suppose there's a question on the back of that. So I was thinking about Mrs. Thatcher, who some reports suggested she was slightly horrified by some of the effects of neoliberal economics upon British society by the end of her tenure. That's perhaps a bit like J.S. Mill. You know, she had a kind of basic Methodist assumption that people would do the right thing when given the opportunity to do so. Which, I mean, I suppose that's a question for our own society now, isn't it? Which perhaps you're going to come on to, Peter, but to talk about how if actually it's about the heart changing. How do you enable that to happen in a liberal society like ours?
Wait till next week.
Okay, good answer.
Yeah, I do talk about both these things, sorry, about those sorts of things in the next two lectures. And particularly, it's not so much next week, I think, but in the week after, lecture number 5, I do talk about the importance of regaining a sense of virtue. So there'll be a little explanation of that in a couple of weeks' time, no doubt with other things as well.
I look forward to it. What's Steve Burgess asks, looking forward to hearing more about that and the spiritual journeys. But what practical things might we do to address the inequalities in society?
Yeah, I've had a number of, thank you very much, Steve, for that. I mean, I've had a number of people, say, what on earth do we do? And it's very difficult actually to as an individual to influence these things, particularly given the sort of, the way representative democracy works and the reluctance of politicians to actually engage in what I would regard as meaningful debate. Some years ago, there was a theme for One World Week. It's rather sort of dropped out of the church calendar these days. But One World Week used to be celebrated in October. And one of the themes for One World Week, I think perhaps 20 or 30 years ago, was think globally, act locally. And at the same time, I remember going to a talk by a former General Secretary of USPG, talking about the marks of mission that should characterize the local church. And one of them was about engaging in some issue of social justice. And I think if we as individuals can think in those terms and also join with others locally, then that's a beginning. And I believe quite strongly that when we do things like that, it's just like when we pray, we send up some sort of energy, which, as it were, joins in some way with other people. It has the same sort of effect, I think, as when you go into a church and you feel that people have prayed in there. There's something about, the attitude of prayer and service which sort of gets into the stonework. And I think in the same way, when we actually do what we can locally, then somehow it begins to change the overall climate. Now, Jane Bartlett, thank you, Jane. Do we need to extend our notion of community and the common good to embrace all of creation? Brother, sun, sister, moon. Is our understanding of community too small? Absolutely. I don't know whether, Jane, whether you've read Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si. I mean, anybody who is concerned about the situation of the poor and the situation of the planet and bringing them together will find much to stimulate them in that encyclical. And one of the things that Francis says there is that at the same time that we hear the cry of the poor, we need to hear the cry of the earth. And I think what you say is absolutely spot on. So
Gillian,
thank you very much for that.
Gillian, you have your hand up. I don't know, did you want to unmute yourself and
Gillian.
Question.
Hello, yes, I'm not quite sure how to put a message on the screen, but I found out how to put my hand up. I wanted to say thank you to Peter for that last example of about slavery, because it seems to me those sudden glimpses of evil that you have, which can really change you and reposition you in the world, are really important. And that was a fantastic example of such a movement. Thank you.
The book is remarkable. I mean, it's a wonderful story. I mean, it has you at the end of your, at the end of it, you're on your seat. Because she changes her attitude completely, and she enables two. Well, maybe if you're going to read it, I won't tell you. But I mean, the end of the story, I was actually on my seat. How's it going to end? It had something of the thriller in it, but it also had some very deep reflections on the way we are. It was one of the best books I've read in recent years.
Do you talk about it in your book? Can I find the reference to it there?
You can. But right. Yes, it's in the book.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you,
I
Peter.
mean, most of what I say is in my book. I mean, you got one or two new bits today, which people who read the book won't get. But and in fact, next week I will add quite a lot of stuff, because not everything in the book is. Well, anyway, I've just made a choice. But basically, what I'm saying is coming out of the book. And
it's page 97, Peter, in the book, for the person who asked that question. Page 97.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, let me...
Chris knows the book better than I do.
Exactly.
Yes, thank you very much.
Well, this is all good news on World Book Day to see such enthusiasm, and further recommendations for reading. So thank you, Gillian and Chris.
Anyway, sorry, Dan, can I just say, I mean, because I think we're about to bring things to an end, but can I just say that if people like to respond, I mean, it's very helpful to me, to get an email or something. Just, it doesn't have to be a sort of biographical account, but I mean, it's just very helpful to know how these things, how the sort of things that I'm saying resonate, and if you'd like to hear about something else. So thank you very much for listening today.
Thank you very much, Peter, and for everyone's questions as well, which are much appreciated and very thoughtful. So we will reconvene next week at the usual time, when Peter will explore Jesus' words, I am the door to life, opening the way to forgiveness and fullness of life. So look forward to seeing you all at 11 o'clock next week.
Thank you.
In the meantime.
God bless everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, brilliant.